there, and welcome back to the Bamboo Chalupa Digital Marketing Podcast. My name is Brett Snyder. I am the president of Knucklepuck, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Nate Shiver, the author of shiverweb.com.
Yes, hello.
So today we are actually into our 24th episode of the podcast, and we want to talk about something that is one of the more highly debated topics in the digital marketing world over the past 3 to 4 years. And that comes down to what was once a social network, then a discovery platform, and now we're not entirely sure what to call it, but we do want to spend some time discussing Google+. Google+ has been one of the most polarizing products Google has put out in recent years, and arguably one of the most significant investments that they have made, both financially and in terms of Google's brand itself. Back in 2011, 25% of all Google employees' bonuses were tied to the success of Google+. And this came right from Larry Page. I think it was within a week of him taking the reins as CEO. And this is not saying that the Google+ product team has their bonuses tied up in this. This is Google as an organization ties 1/4 of all their bonuses to the success of Google+. And this had started as a social network, and it was, even though Google never came out and say that, most people kind of looked at this as a competitor to the likes of Facebook and Twitter. But when adoption of this platform was less than ideal, Google pivoted a little bit, and they sought to incorporate Google+ into the existing Google experience, more so as a product than necessarily as a social network. You'll remember that they integrated their privacy policy, tying everything back to your Google+ profile. GChat became absorbed into Google+ Hangouts, both in terms of just the regular text chat as well as the video conferencing. Google+ Local, all the local platform, it used to be Google Places, was transitioned over to, Google+ pages and is now once again, evolved into what we know as Google My Business. They now have Google Streams and Google Photos. And, most of us, especially in the marketing sphere, will remember the now defunct Google Authorship, where Google was trying to tie actual content written on the web to the author that produced that content. And all of these things have one very particular characteristic in common, and that is this idea of identity. Said at the very beginning, where I have never considered Google+ to be a social network, but now more than ever, it's become apparent that Google+ is much more of an identity network than anything else.
Yeah, I really think identity is a perfect way to put it, because I think when it launched, I know the vast majority of the public consumers, even myself, when I first signed up, chase that red herring that, oh, this is not Facebook. This is Google's better version of Facebook. But I really don't think, even though, yes, that was reason behind Google+, I think identity really was the whole master plan behind it. Because if you think about it, identity is where both the entire web and the money that's on the web has been moving for quite some time, even before Facebook. Facebook was almost like a startup founded because of the shift towards identity. And Google+ was Google's attempt to get on board that trend.
And if you kind of look at it, it's a pretty logical progression. If you talk about this idea of identity, you can back that into this idea of a personalized web experience. And now social networks are largely predicated on this idea of having a personalized web experience based around the people that you choose to interact with. And so when you think about it in that lens, the idea of a social network versus an identity network is a very logical progression from one to the next. Really tying back, Nate, to what you were saying, is Google needed to find a way to compete in the evolving internet landscape. User activity has changed. What user expectations of their search engine have changed. We've said this before. Facebook is a search engine in a lot of ways. Twitter is a search engine in a lot of ways. Now you're searching a very different index. You're searching a very different database of information, but it's a way for people to be able to go out there and find information. You talk about Google's main, point when they started was to organize the world's information. Facebook and Twitter, now leveraging this whole crowdsourcing and user-generated content, are starting to organize the world's information in a slightly different way than the traditional Google search results. And so that's why when you talk about this idea of tying it back to identity, tying it back to what an individual user is interested in, and catering the experience directly to those needs, that's where Google Plus is, the real value is, and that's why Google has invested so much time and money and brand power into this platform.
The changes in the search search results brought on by Google Plus got a lot of fanfare. You know, the authorship and the photos beside of it and, you know, what people are sharing. But Google search results, they began changing and moving into the realm of personalization long before Google Plus. And even on the ad side, you know, Google's display ads, before they had the unified Google Plus identity, they still had ways to target people's identity that went beyond, you know, the old contextual advertising or looking at what keywords were on the page and serving up a banner ad on that. You know, I mean, retargeting was in place. And so I think even though Google Plus is framed as a versus Facebook or a social network type situation, I think the trend is bigger than that, you know, like you said, Google needs a way to understand who you are across websites, devices, searches, everything.
You know, one thing you could say for Google is they're not giving up on this platform. You know, adoption was less than they would have hoped, less than I think they would have anticipated, given the fact that they are so pervasive in our everyday lives. But they've admittedly started to pull away from a purely social experience, but not from a connecting experience or an identity experience. You know, Google Plus still exists to connect users through that common experience. And kind of like we talked about with, you know, the logical progression there, is this common experience really that far off from social networking? You know, you look at the actual tagline that Google Plus uses. You know, they claim to connect people around shared interest and patterns. You know, as far as we're concerned, the plan for Google Plus moving forward, from everything that we've seen over the past several years and see with the way that they're investing in this common experience, Google is looking to double down on this concept of connecting people around their common interests, because they know that they can use insights from those relationships to be able to improve their products across the board.
Yeah. So as far as what's happening in July of 2015 and what I think will happen moving forward, or at least how we can peer into the future a little bit, is that Google Plus, as it was known in 2011, 2012, 2013, is dead. You know,
another SEO platform is dead. Another wild card is dead.
Oh yeah, another one bites the dust, because I know SEOs, we were the first ones to nicely fill out our Google Plus profile and set up our Google business pages and to sort all of our contacts into the circles and to tag all of our posts with the appropriate hashtags, all that.
We were the ones to sync our accounts when you had a personal account and a business account. You know, you understood, how do we, you know, share access to this? What actually types of engagement in there? What are plus ones versus circles?
It was a pretty in-depth universe with its own ultimate guides and best tips and everything else. But what's interesting is that according to former Google engineers, you know, it began life as a functional search-oriented value proposition for universal search. So I mean, that's how they sold it, was that this is going to make Google search better rather than, you know, Google's Facebook, even though with the way it launched, that's what it became in the general public. It became Google's Facebook where no one is at.
And I think it's almost unfair for it to have been compared that way, because it's offering similar functionalities, but the fact that it offers photo sharing doesn't necessarily mean that it's out there to try to compete with Facebook. It did not have the network. You know, it was looked at, I always considered Google Plus to be more of a discovery network, where it's a social, like Facebook is the social network you go to when you have a social network. You just want to translate that online. Google Plus, to me, was always an opportunity to be able to find new social networks, to find new networks that you can break into based on these common interests.
Yeah, but either way, however we knew it back then, that's gone. So it's now broken into Google Streams and Google Photos and Google Hangouts. Basically, all the different parts that we knew of as Google Plus have broken apart into basically a process known as unbundling is the jargon for it. But in July of 2015, I mean, it's left behind a big legacy because, you know, again, going back to the identity theme, Google has now unified all of its products around a single privacy policy. That's a big deal. And even though Google Plus never got a ton of active users, keep in mind that Gmail, which now, because of the Google Plus project, has the same login as all the other Google products, Gmail has 900 million active users. That's not Facebook, but that's still a lot of people that Google knows a lot of information about and has a common identity.
And remember that, and this is something that, people, for whatever reason, seem to get really thrown by this, but remember, Google reads your emails. That's how they determine what's spam. It's how they determine the ads that you see around there. Now, they're not mining this information in a Big Brother way, but they have access to all of this personal information already. And Google Plus just gave them the opportunity, at least behind the scenes, to marry this information with other sources, with the YouTube videos that you watch, with what you click on in your search results, with what paid ads or retargeting ads you click on. Google was able to, put everything under one roof so that they can associate these complementary experiences, but still independent, under one umbrella.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that in many ways, Google has leapfrogged back up to the front of the trend, because this whole idea of having complementary experiences across different apps with a common identity is happening in the big other tech companies. I mean, if you look at what Facebook is doing, Facebook, they've unbundled their news app. They own Instagram, they own WhatsApp. They have all these different experiences that they're all unified by the Facebook back end. But as far as the user experience, Instagram is very different than the Facebook paper or, that their news app or a WhatsApp chat. And
that's very much intentional.
Oh, yeah.
It's very much intentional for these to remain, from a consumer side of things, to remain independent.
Yeah, and so either way, I think, again, it goes back to big trends. And I think the web, it's swinging back towards being fragmented among all these apps. This is something that happened in the late 90s when AOL and Prodigy and all the big platforms broke up and everything split into all these different specialized websites. And I think it's happening again. But the key thing is that the big providers of these services are still trying to maintain the foundational identity across all of these unbundled experiences that they still own.
So let's talk a little bit about, we've kind of given the background here, but why does this matter? It's a core premise of our podcast here. It's like, why does this matter? Why does Google Plus matter to marketers? And why does this idea of unbundling and fragmentation matter? There's no denying that when it came out, even before anybody ever tried it, when it came out, Google Plus was a huge deal. Huge deal when it rolled out, because it was a new Google product. They obviously invested a ton of money and a ton of their brand behind pushing this Google Plus platform. And as Nate mentioned, every SEO out there, every digital marketer in particular, drank the Kool-Aid, and we were Google's biggest boosters. We were the early adopters, and that was very, very much by design. We've talked on the podcast before about triggering the herd, how Google wants to introduce kind of concepts so that they can trigger some key influencers, in this case, marketers or early adopters to these tech trends, to be able to get people to recognize the value of this identity platform and what it can do to provide an enhanced user experience. By tying this back to universal search, Google actually, hedged a little bit. They ensured that our highly passionate community would take notice and would investigate how to leverage this platform for information sharing. As marketers, we're all about going out there and, obviously we want the user engagement, but we measure that through impressions, we measure that through traffic, we measure that through conversions. The problem with Google Plus is that it didn't necessarily offer anything other than another stream of traffic that could have been replicated elsewhere, and the network itself was never really able to compete. With Google Hangouts, there was already Skype. Skype had been around for a long, long time. There's other video conferencing business, that cater specifically to B2B sites. You look at Zoom, or you look at BlueJeans, some of the newer ones that are coming out. You talk about cloud sharing. Dropbox has been, and Box.net have existed for years and years and years. Google Plus provided a lot of cool information. It provided a lot of cool features, but nothing was really, from a consumer perspective, nothing was independent about what you could do on Google Plus that you could not get from some other platform that you had already invested in and you had already built that presence for. And so that's why we get this big criticism that Google Plus, from a consumer perspective and from a marketing perspective even, was a huge waste.
When I think about the history of marketing and advertising, digital marketers like to say that John Wanamaker's quip about old school, Mad Men type advertising. He once said that, I know that half of my advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half. And he used to say that, talking about the old school Mad Men type agencies that would give him a bill and he wouldn't know how to cut it. But digital marketers, we used to say that quip is no longer true because we can track everything, because we know exactly where your sales are coming from, and we can invest in only what's working. But trends like this, where SEOs and marketers say, you should do Google Plus. We got to invest in Google Plus, and pairing that with trends, like Facebook killing off organic reach, seem to disprove the idea that digital is different than old school advertising, that digital is just another version of, we got to try everything. We don't know what's going to be a waste, but we got to try everything instead.
It's funny when you think about it that way, because attribution has gotten so advanced. Even in free tools like Google Analytics, you can look at attribution, conversion funnels, and and referral sources and everything down to to minute details. And that's on the free platform. You can look at these Marketo types of platforms that help you track exactly what somebody's doing, even if they don't volunteer the information. You can look at your Site Catalyst and your Omniture, these larger in-depth analytics programs that give you all this information. And it almost got to the point where we have because attribution is so advanced, that we get to the point where we're not really entirely sure if we're doing it right, because you get almost down to so much detail on it where, did it make sense for us to be? Is Google Plus, how do you measure the benefits of the relationships built, or the expanding your social network just in terms of somebody you might be able to find their email address? There's a lot of different ways that Google Plus had immeasurable, and I mean that, or unmeasurable, not immeasurable in the, too big to be measured, but immeasurable, if that's even a word, in the sense that it cannot be measured, impact on what marketers were able to do to be able to go out there and enhance those existing traffic and conversion streams in a way that maybe they weren't able to before.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Google Plus specifically, there's still an audience there. It's international and tech savvy and very focused on interest, kind of in the Pinterest, Reddit vein rather than the traditional social network, Facebook, Twitter vein. But Google Plus, as far as SEO goes and marketing goes, is definitely a declining force. And, especially since authorship has been dead and there's now no real relationship between Google Plus and SEO. So in a way, it's true.
I would disagree, though, and just to kind of interrupt that, I would disagree. Maybe it's not as explicit, but I still think that like any of these networks where maybe you're not tracking engagement within the platform, we're looking at it in terms of Google Plus did not drive links, it did not drive traffic to my website, but did it drive relationships? And I think that's why I've always been, kind of on the camp of Google Plus maybe is not doing exactly what it went out there to do, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's not value in it. There's always been value in what we do with Google Plus. It's just kind of, Nate, to your point before, where you have to understand exactly who that niche audience is that's really engaging there, and understanding what your goals need to be going into investing in something like Google Plus. It's not necessarily going to be circles and plus ones, but it may be relationships in a way that can't be measured in the traditional sense.
Well, no, I think that's exactly right, because I think the key is to focus on not whether or not this trend or that trend was wasted or not wasted, but to look at how were you able to use it for your audience and your customers, and what were you able to keep from it? Just like if you were to run a giant TV ad campaign, I mean, the people at the giant ad agency, they would say, don't look at whether or not this ad on this channel, drove X number of sales. Let's look and see overall brand sentiment. How are we able to use, this campaign? How can we segment it correctly to look at it in a way to see if the data that we got from it was useful to us?
Yeah, and I think that gets down to, you can do a whole lot. I think it's a huge, like you said, we've said it identity platform. We've called it a discovery platform. We've called it everything really except a social network. But I think it's a huge opportunity, just given how much information is there. Maybe it's not what somebody volunteers, but being able to look at these Google Plus profiles and being able to understand, all right, here's where somebody maybe has contributed to in the past. I know for me, once Google authorship ended, I didn't go out and remove my contributor to section. I've used, Google Plus as an opportunity to find out where key influencers are writing. What are some additional sources that we can be looking at? It's a wealth of information when you just look at what maybe isn't constantly updated. You look at the actual identity information, so the profiles themselves rather than the activity. I think that's when, you can look at that and say, here is a huge opportunity for us to continue to extract value from this platform, even if it's not so much in the traditional social networking posting, not your tweets or your Facebook posts, but the actual information inherent to that profile and into that identity. So let's talk a little bit. We talked about consumers. We've touched on, or marketers, excuse me. We've touched on consumers as well. But, and this comes out to a very kind of common theme we've had here today, where Google Plus is going increasingly synonymous with just Google. And Google is increasingly synonymous with just the web or web activity, and finding ways to serve users as a product rather than a network. I think when I started to consider Google Plus as a product, as another one of Google's products similar to Gmail, I really started to recognize how much value there really was from a consumer perspective, because now you are able to say, I want to be able to save my search history. I want to be able to know if I can +1 certain content that I know it can come back for, almost like a social bookmarking site. I want to be able to understand what key influencers are and what they're interested in should I wish to reach out to them. More often than not, that information is available right in the Google Plus profile. And you talk about the growth of video conferencing and cloud storage. These are core aspects of the new Google Plus. You can look at social. You can look at the idea of local with reviews. Reviews are an inherently social behavior when you leave reviews on a small business. There's a very explicit reason why Google Plus moved their local platform onto Google Plus pages, because they wanted to harness this social activity that's inherent to things like reviews in tying it back to that ongoing quest towards identity management. When we talk about it does benefit the consumer, but you also think about, why does Google continue to invest in this? Because Google is able to provide a more integrated experience, and Google is able to tie that back to the way that they make money and the way that they want to invest in the growth of their business by having better information about those consumers and being able to provide services catered much more specifically to those needs.
Oh yeah, because the more they know about you, the better they can serve advertising to meet your needs, and the better they can serve advertising, the more successful their business, which is, if you look at Google's percent of revenue, that is their business. And the more successful their advertising, the more money. And at the end of the day, the money is what's going to matter. Now, Google's marketing and PR department that's pitching you on using Google's products, they want you to believe that, they're all about making the world a better place, but that's always aligned with how it increases their stock price. And
Google will make the world a better place insofar as it gives Larry Page a better place to live.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so it's this self-interest that you have to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about lessons going forward, because I think the biggest lesson from the death of Google Plus as we knew it is that, no matter what relationships you get out of it, no matter how you hedge it, it's a huge risk to put 100% of your social media efforts or your marketing efforts into a single platform, whether it ultimately succeeds or not, or pivots or does whatever happens.
Yeah, and this isn't just social media efforts. This is any efforts. If we accept that Google Plus is not trying to be a social network, the same principles apply. You don't want to be investing 100% of your social efforts into something like Facebook or Twitter as well, because then when they kill off organic reach, have you invested in something that's no longer sustainable for you? If you start to say, hey, there was a huge backlash there's a PR disaster on our Facebook page, we have to shut it down. What happens now? The idea of diversification is something that we've harped on, I think, Nate, from our very first episode. I think that was our first episode we ever did on the podcast here, was talking about diversifying your marketing efforts. And when you talk about something like Google Plus, it's important to at least have a working understanding of how that platform plays a role in the way that your audience makes decisions. Now, whether you are a B2B company, whether you are B2C, it's still important to understand how your consumers make buying decisions, even if you are not even something that sells a product or a service. Maybe you're like, like my friend Nate here in the publishing business. Your product, you are selling page views, and you are selling it for, for time. People are giving you their time to read that. They're giving you the opportunity to share and to speak to them. So when we start to think about it from that perspective, you want to make sure that you have this diversified approach, that you have a working knowledge of what Google Plus can do to be able to help with that identity management, while also ensuring that you are using that in the context of the greater marketing discipline, where you have to know that this is just one tool, it is one tactic, it is not a piece of it is not your overall strategy, but it's a tactic or a tool that can be used to enhance that strategy.
Yeah, and so I would boil the lessons moving forward down to 4 things. 1, don't do digital sharecropping. Sharecropping was a practice in the Old South after the Civil War, where landowners would go to a tenant and say, hey, I'm not going to pay you a wage, but I'm not going to let you buy any of my land. So here's the deal. You work for me, raise the crops, and at the end, I'll give you a cut. That's a bad deal all the way around. Don't build someone else's network. Don't build someone else's platform unless you're getting direct payment or you actually own a piece of your ground, aka your website, which is the second thing that I would keep in mind, is to always remember that your website is it. It is the one thing that you own, the one thing that you 100% control, and the one thing that you can customize and will never go away as long as you're paying your hosting bills, and will never go out of business until you go out of business. Third, I would say always take easy wins with an agile approach. Just because you want to try out Google Plus doesn't mean you need to go head first. Just because you don't want to go head first into the latest, greatest, newest thing, like, I don't know, Periscope or that thing that you mentioned, Brett, the blue jeans, doesn't mean
or Meerkat,
or
any of
Meerkat. That just because you don't want to go head first and spend all your day, all day long on it, doesn't mean you can't set up a profile and test it out with your current audience to see if it's a fit. And lastly, I would say to remember that your brand is more important than ever. Less people need to be able to think of your brand and know where to search for you. Even if they can't remember your domain name, if they can remember to search for you, search for your brand, they'll be able to find you. But maintaining that positive association with your brand is more important than ever.
And I think the one kind of caveat to add to that, I agree that you don't want to go headstrong into a platform that you don't know anything about, but you also want to make sure that you give it at least its due chance. You don't want to just go in there and say, hey, I made a profile on Google Plus and nobody circled me in the first 3 days. This is useless. I'm not going to bother. You want to make sure that you're giving it a legitimate chance, that you're taking the time, even if it's only a couple of hours, but you're taking a couple of hours to turn off Twitter, to turn off Facebook, to try to sit there and maybe put on some headphones, listen to some, relaxing music, and just say, let me try to find where this can be valuable for me. I think the biggest thing going into that and being able to test things out is you want to go in there with an open mind. You don't want to go in there saying Google Plus is stupid, it's a ghost town, nobody's going to be here, because then you're going to have, a self-fulfilling prophecy with what you're able to learn from that network. So when you do go in there and you want to take that, look for the easy wins with that agile approach, you want to make sure that you're at least giving it enough of a legitimate effort on your part to be able to understand where that is, because then you're just the people, everybody I'm sure has seen the, the comic or even it's the analytics graph where they say most bloggers stop writing here, and you see when your traffic stats are at the bottom, which is why most never make it here, and you see the big spike right after they stop writing. You want to make sure that you're investing at least enough time that you feel confident that you have turned over every stone in terms of how you might be able to leverage this network to serve your audience. And so just to kind of wrap this up, when we talked about for marketers, Google Plus is dead and Google Plus was worthless, as most people will say, but Facebook organic reach is just as dead. But very few would argue that it was worthless, or that an investment in your Facebook presence was worthless. Just to go back and really hammer home Nate's point there, the key is to adopt that agile approach, that there is no silver bullet, there is no template. What you did to grow your Facebook audience is not going to be as successful to grow your Google Plus audience. There may be significant overlaps between the folks that you're able to connect with on both platforms, but the way that those consumers, are the way that these consumers wish to engage and wish to interact with your brand on both of these platforms needs to be distinct. Because if not, what's the point of having both? As people talk about, one of the biggest social media best practices is you can have Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, but if you post something, just posting the same content to Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn is kind of a waste of your time, because what's the point for somebody to follow Twitter or LinkedIn if they already like you on Facebook? You want to be able to understand that Google Plus may have no overt consumer benefit to you as a marketer that you can exploit, but it does establish identity. And for a company like Google, with the ad platform that they've established and understanding the way that they use identity to essentially structure their entire business, that is going to be the key to sustainable growth. And that's going to be the key to understanding how you as a marketer can take advantage of a platform like Google Plus, or to Nate's point, something like your Periscope, something like a Meerkat, one of these emerging technologies. The way that you're going to be able to look at that to find ways to sustain the growth and sustain the success that you see on that platform is by understanding the identity of the audience you engage with there.
So you can find previous episodes, links to things that we mentioned, and our contact information at bamboochalupa.com. If you don't want to miss another episode, please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And please leave a comment and rating while you're there. We learn a lot from your feedback, and your ratings also help others discover the show. So for Brett Snyder, I'm Nate Shiver. Thank you for listening.